Good afternoon. So we have moved slowly to the second half of the 19th century, and we're coming slowly again towards the end of the century. We have two very important writers who are considered to be the best authors of the end of the 19th century, and those are Mark Twain and Henry James. The two authors are so unlike one another, but they're both very instrumental in developing the distinct American identity. I'm going to start with Mark Twain, and next week we're going to speak about Henry James. Mark Twain died in 1910, so you get the feel that he worked mostly in the second half of the 19th century. He is the first important American author to write in a genuinely American dialect, and he constructed a genuinely American idiom, which we call native idiom. And today he is mostly famous for his adventure stories featuring Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, but you will see that these two boys and these two books are very different from one another. Mark Twain was born as Samuel Langhorne Clemens. So Mark Twain is actually a pseudonym, and I will explain what the pseudonym means later on. He was born in a frontier village, which is important because he did write about the frontier humor and frontier adventures in Missouri, in Florida, and he spent his childhood in a city which is called Hannibal and is situated on the Mississippi River. I'm sure you know that Sawyer's and Finn's adventures are set mostly around the Mississippi River, which is why this is so important. The river is actually shown as a pretty dangerous place, very busy, and there is violence there, which is mostly depicted in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Mark Twain started his career working for various local printers, but it was his dream to become a steamboat pilot, river pilot on the Mississippi River, and he actually fulfilled that dream until the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, because the Civil War interrupted the traffic on the river. So Mark Twain was forced to delve in other things. For example, he delved in timber and silver mining, but he was not so successful in these ventures. Then he turned reporter for various newspapers, and this is where his career basically started, because at around this time he adopted the pseudonym Mark Twain. Mark Twain is riverman's term, let's say, for water that is only just safe for a boat or a ship to be navigated over. So it is very shallow water, but it is safe, which means that Mark Twain is always on the edge. So he speaks about something in symbols and in metaphors, and when we laugh when we read these different humorous episodes, we should bear in mind that he actually wanted to say something else, which is again especially seen in Huckleberry Finn. His first published short story is Dandy Frightening the Squatter. The dandy is, I'm sure you're familiar with the term because of Oscar Wilde. So it's a sleek gentleman from the city, and the squatter would be a woodsman. And now in the story, the dandy wants to show off in front of some girls, and he wants to frighten the squatter, but he doesn't succeed in doing so because the squatter throws him and knocks him into the river. So this is basically a parody of the fight between the civilization, which is symbolized in the dandy, and the countryside or the nature, which is symbolized in the squatter. And this story was actually pretty successful at that time. In 1865, so the end of the American Civil War, Twain published another good story, which is called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. He published the story in a New York journal, and the story is actually about a frog. It's about a man who had a pet frog, and he wanted to teach the frog to jump higher than any other frogs. and he has a rival who feeds that frog with bullets. So the frog is not able to jump as high as the man would expect, so he loses the bet. And this is what the story is about. So you can see that the topics that Twain at first dealt with are pretty satirical and humorous and even ironic. He parodied the country he was born in, and of course, this had a certain goal, as you will see. Twain also worked as a traveling correspondent, and I think this is where his career actually started off because of his travel accounts. So please remember that his travel accounts were extremely, remarkably successful, and I'm just going to tell you titles of some of these. Letters from the Sandwich Islands, Letters from Honolulu, Mark Twain's Travels with Mr. Brown, and so on. But the travel account that actually made him famous was called The Innocents Abroad, or The New Pilgrim's Progress. Pilgrim's Progress is, of course, an allusion to the work written by John Bunyan, which is called The Pilgrim's Progress. Na srpskom bi to bilo, recimo, putovanje jednog hodočasnika. Ne znam da li se sećate tog dela sa Bubanjinog kursa, ali glavni lik u delu Johna Bunjana je izvesni Kristijan. Naravno, to je aluzija na hrišćanina koji prolazi svetom i uči neke hrišćanske vrednosti, ali i mane, i sada je ovo parodija zapravo na to. The Innocents Abroad. The innocence from the title refers to the Americans. It is based on Mark Twain's actual experiences when he went on a voyage through Europe and the Holy Land together with some Americans. So he described how these Americans and himself felt during this voyage, because they felt like innocents wondering at the marvels of the old world, which is to say Europe. And in fact, all the time they were not aware that they looked very outlandish to the Europeans. So this is what made him famous, The Innocents Abroad. But of course, later he published other travel accounts, such as Roughing It, for example, or A Tramp Abroad, and so on. At the same time, while he was contributing these travel accounts to various newspapers around America, he started working on his novels. So The Adventures of Tom Sawyer would be his first novel, which recalls Twain's boyhood memories of his own life on the Mississippi River. Then The Prince and the Pauper and The Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. These two are pieces of historical fiction. And The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which he published in 1885, so exactly 20 years after the American Civil War, in which he actually criticizes the aftermath of that war. So this last novel, Huckleberry Finn, is actually very sinister in tone, and it is not a boy's novel. So Tom Sawyer is a boy's adventure novel, but The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is an adult fiction and very serious if you actually take time to interpret some episodes. But let me tell you first something about these two pieces of historical fiction. The Prince and the Pauper would be the first, published in 1882. You're probably familiar with this story, Dakle, Prince I Prosjak. So the main protagonists from the title are two boys who are identical, but one is a pauper, and his name is Tom Canty, and his father is very abusive, and he's living in London slums. The other boy is Prince of Wales, who is later to become Edward VI, and he was the only son of King Henry VIII. You remember the saga about this king wanting to have a son, and Edward VI actually died when he was very young. So the boys encounter one another, and they are fascinated at the extent of their resemblance. So they decide to switch places for some time, and this motif of switching places allows Twain to comment on the hypocrisies and the prejudices of this world. So what happens is that the prince, the actual prince, is mistaken for the pauper because they look alike, and this is what makes the story a comedy of errors. Na srpskom bi to bilo komedija pometnje. And this actually suggests that clothes make a man. And this idea is so fascinating, of course, with which I partially agree, I have to say, but it's open to discussion. And the prince of Wales, well, he starts to sympathize with all these poor people that he encounters, whereas Tom, who is now a prince, becomes a tyrant because of his surroundings. So Twain actually explores the extent to which your environment can affect who you are. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court is another piece of historical fiction. It was published in 1889. And uh, we can say this is one of the earliest science fiction stories because it depicts time travel. But the story is very complicated regarding the narrative frameworks because Mark Twain actually is inspired by his own dream of being a knight who cannot stand the weight of his armor. And with this outer frame, he actually ridicules the romantic notions of chivalry and he wants to expose them for what they really are. So the main protagonist of this novel is Hank Morgan, who is a Yankee engineer, and he's transported somehow back in time to the court of King Arthur, whom you all know from famous English legends. So Hank Morgan pretends to be a magician because of his knowledge. He's an engineer, as I said, and he performs all these scientific tricks that makes people believe, the people in the past believe that he is a magician, and he amazes them because we are speaking about the early Middle Ages. However, despite of his attempts to modernize their past, this does not end well because King Arthur has to die. So Hank Morgan is not able to change history, and the Catholic Church actually begins to grow fearful of Hank Morgan, and it issues an order against him. So this is a satire in which Mark Twain blames the Catholic Church for all the social injustice that he could encounter in America, and he attacks England also because this happens during the time of King Arthur, especially the England of the 19th century, which is all concealed in this fine satire, Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. So the structure of the story, as I said, is really complex because there is a frame story. The narrator meets a stranger who tells him the story of his own travel in time, and he just delivers him some papers that contain the rest of his story. So what we are actually reading is the account of this stranger whom the narrator had met. So this would be the frame story. And regarding the science fiction part of it, it's interesting, for example, that this novel was published 70 years after Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, in which you also know time travel appears. And it was published some 6 years before the famous novel The Time Machine by A.G. Wells, which is the most important novel featuring this time travel phenomenon. The difference between these three stories is that Connecticut Yankee is the only one in which the main protagonist travels back in time, whereas the narrator of The Time Machine and Rip Van Winkle travel to the future. So these two pieces of historical fiction were Mark Twain's attempts to use history in order to warn us against some social injustices which were happening in this world. Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn are another type of fiction which he also uses to criticize our society. So Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn are two boys who are often mentioned together. but they're so unlike one another. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer was a novel published in 1876 in which just let me recount the basis of the plot briefly. Tom and Huck witnessed a murder committed by Injun Joe, and this is, of course, committed in a graveyard. It is midnight, so this is a satirical attempt at creating a gothic atmosphere. So the boy are frightened and they run away. Everybody thinks that they're dead, and they organize their funeral, which is actually observed by Tom and Huck. Later on in the novel, Tom and his sweetheart, Becky, are in a cave and they discover where Injun Joe is hiding. So they are able to collect the reward for his hiding place. Now, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn would be the sequel to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. It was published in 1885, and the book begins with the description of the end of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. So at the end of Tom Sawyer, Huck is actually adopted by widow Douglas, who wants to civilize Huck because he saved her life. In this first book, Tom Sawyer, Huck is around 12 or 13 years old, whereas in his own narration, he is a year older. So, how are these two boys so different? Well, although Tom is more manipulative and he is very mischievous, but we have to stress that he is tradition grounded and he is well educated. He has a normal functioning family, whereas Huck is his complete opposite. He's ignorant of so many things. He's just a simple boy who's trying to tell his own story as he sees it. So there is a great difference between the way in which Tom sees the world and Huck observes everything that's going on around him. So even though Huck also deceives some people, he does this to survive because it's his nature. He has learned to cope with deceit, and he does these deceits instinctively and not on purpose, unlike Tom Sawyer, of course. Huckleberry Finn does not have a normal family. He lives with an alcoholic and very abusive father. So his goal is to escape, which he does. He fakes his own death and he escapes. Now, this escape is the crux of the book because he does this with a black man whose name is Jim. Jim and Huck travel on the Mississippi River, and there are many different adventurous stories, what happens to them on the river, which is exposed as an extremely dangerous place. And one thing that I have to stress is that Huck is actually worried. He's worried about escaping with a black man because that was not actually allowed at the time. Remember, the book was published 20 years after the American Civil War, and uh, he wants to show us that things had not really changed for the black people, for the African American people. And at the end, when Jim finds his freedom finally, Huck is again about to be civilized. But he says he doesn't want to be civilized because he says, I've been there and I've done that, and I don't like being civilized. So, with this comment, Mark Twain criticizes the very notion of civilization because his Huck, Twain's Huck, is a symbol of honesty and of conscience, and civilization is anything but honest, according to Mark Twain. Um, the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is narrated in Huck's own voice, and this is, I think, very important because it makes the novel somewhat of a Bildungsroman, similar to J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, for example, and Sue Townsend's The Secret Diary of Adrian Mole. Because when a teenager narrates his own story, it tends to be very naive and very funny, and yet at the same time, it's so deep. I'm sure you know, or you have maybe heard that the killer of John Lennon read The Catcher in the Rye, and he identified so much with the main character of the book, Holden Caulfield, who tells his own story, that he decided that John Lennon was a hypocrite, and this is why he killed him. So the power of a book should never be underestimated, unfortunately. So Huckleberry Finn is the one who allows Mark Twain to say those things about his own society and his contemporary America, because it is said by a boy and not by Mark Twain. Actually, this is a mask. In Huck's voice, we can hear Mark Twain's opinions and his own voices. Other books also feature Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, but Tom Sawyer, at least based on the volumes of books that came after, was Mark Twain's favorite in a way. So let me just read some titles that feature Tom in the future. Tom Sawyer Abroad, Tom Sawyer Detective, and later there were some tales published as Hannibal, Huck, and Tom. So please remember that Tom Sawyer is a boys' book, whereas Huckleberry Finn is not juvenile fiction. It is a very serious account of what was going on in America at the time. This is why we say that The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is one of the great American novels. Some people say also Tom Sawyer, but I will definitely vote for Huck Finn because it describes America, the America of that time. So the sentiment that the Americans felt after the American Civil War. One especially valuable commentary about Huck comes from T.S. Eliot, who was the most important modernist. Basically, he wrote Wasteland, published in 1922, and he compares Huck and Finn, saying that both these boys are one aspect of Mark Twain. Tom Sawyer is the boy that Mark Twain had been. Huckleberry Finn, he says, is the boy that Mark Twain still was at the time of writing his adventures. So in Huckleberry Finn, we should see the adult boy in Twain. So he kept something boyish for Huckleberry Finn, but he also at the same time made him an adult who experienced so many misfortunes in his brief life. When you just look at the illustration of Huckleberry Finn, you see that he is a different boy, that he suffers a lot. For example, he wears, and I can see the illustration here, these are clothes of a full-grown man, an adult man, and these are received as charity, as we are informed. So he has a torn hat, and he has trousers which are supported with only one suspender, and this is his signature look. So he looks like a boy who is trapped in adult clothes, and this is what he feels most of the time. To conclude, let me just quote what T.S. Eliot said about Huckleberry Finn. He says, "There is no more solitary character in fiction than Huck Finn." So we should feel sorry for this boy because although his voice, his narrative voice is carefree and humorous, he is deep down a very unfortunate boy. So this is what I had to say about Mark Twain. Of course, there are many other things to single out. For example, you should pay attention to one episode from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is chapter 38. Tom Sawyer appears in The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. In this particular chapter, the two boys, want to free, and I have to say free, Jim from slavery. Jim is held in a household, and he was actually free all the time. And Tom knew that because his previous owner had freed him before she died. However, Tom decides not to tell Jim that he is free so that he could play a game with him. He persuades Jim, for example, to tame a rattlesnake in his room, or to tame a rat, or he wants to persuade him to grow a flower and to water the flower with his own tears. So why does Tom do it? Because he wants to write his own adventure novel and he needs adventures. So Huck actually joins in this deceit, and we can see now that Huck in this particular episode is not that naive anymore because of Tom's influence. So this is the point in the book where all laughter stops. The way these two boys deal with this black man is just appalling. And by the end of the book, we realize that Jim, the black slave, is the only uh, good and natural and rightful and honest character in this book. So none of the whites are actually good, including Huck and of course Tom Sawyer. He's so mischievous that we have to reprimand him in our minds. For example, this is also interesting. Nobody in the book criticizes Tom for his behavior. They just consider it, funny, which it is not. Just playing with a person's life, especially if it is a black slave, is cruel. And it says that despite the American Civil War, the position of the African Americans did not change at all. So these are just some bits and pieces of information that I can tell you during this brief lecture. Of course, you will read this in depth later on. And next week, we will speak about Henry James and compare his contribution to the American literature to that of Mark Twain. You will see how different these two authors are, but there are certain things in which they are very similar, not to say the same. So see you next week.